Hey, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to another episode of History Check. We are going to dive into some very, very fun fourth dimension today. Very exciting. Ooh. If it's your first time with History Check, we should probably introduce myself and my co host. My name is Meredith Gerber. I'm the RPG Century Publisher Relations Representative, and I am joined with.
My name is Eddy Webb, but my pronouns are he, him. I am the owner of Pugsteady, and I am the in-house developer at Onyx Math Publishing.
Yes. My pronouns are she, her. We're on a time schedule right now
Right,
with
so we're
Google
gonna get through
Hangouts.
this.
So I'm just like, my name is Meredith. This is Eddy. Let's go. Also, special thanks to Lysa Penrose, our DMs Guild brand manager, and also our tech wizard, who this would not be possible without. So thank you,
No.
Lysa.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. So if it's your first time, this is how this works. It's kind of an interview process. Eddy and I have been peers and friends for over a decade, and Eddy has a lot of knowledge about the industry. And we wanted to create this because a lot of times the industry has a history that's for very specific companies and bigger things that happen. And we're kind of going to take it down a little bit to look at the other things that have influenced the industry. So let's get to it. Eddy, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about Timemaster, Adventures in the Fourth Dimension, which came out in 1984 by Pacesetter.
Ooh. Awesome.
Yeah, so blah, blah. I got distracted there because I was like, I said a thing, and now we're done.
We're done. That's it. Great show, everyone.
Right. That's it. That's the whole game. No. I picked this game specifically because it's an interesting look into mid '80s games. We looked at late '70s, early '80s, and now we're moving into kind of the mid part of the 1980s. This is really the boom of RPGs. So kind of for context, and also once again, shout out to the amazing series Designers and Dragons, because it's really good reference for this, and also the introduction to the book we're using today. The re-release also has some great history in that. But so a year before this game came out, in 1983, the D&D cartoon launched. But it also at the same year was the release of Bad or Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. So D&D is becoming a cultural phenomenon, but also simultaneously we have the rise of the satanic panic, which was people's belief that games like Dungeons and Dragons inspired people to satanic activities and also to very dangerous activities. So this is a very interesting time because a lot of people want to move into the space, but are also very concerned about how they're going to move into the tabletop space. And this is big business in two very distinct ways. One is, again, like a year or two previously, D&D is showing up in bookstores now. It is selling in the millions of units. It is being sold in a way that it is in no way, shape, or form selling the past 10 years. But also TSR, having become a large company, just had in 1983 multiple rounds of layoffs. So by the time 84 comes around, about 200 people had left the company, whether it being directly laid off or by choosing to leave as a result. So this is Time Master is one of the first games to come out that was created by people who used to be employed by TSR. So we're looking at the very first wave of post TSR products. So very, very good. Look at that time period.
Awesome. And you mentioned Designers and Dragons, which I want to pull out a little bit further. That's available on DriveThru. I'll put the links in. Excellent books. If you really want to get into the history guts, that is great starting point. So we will put that in there.
Indeed.
I didn't know there was a D&D cartoon.
You didn't know about the D&D cartoon?
No, I didn't know. Oh my gosh.
You could probably find at least clips of it on YouTube. It is good is not a word I would use to describe it. It is interesting. Digression, but the basic premise is it's 4 kids who get onto a roller coaster, D&D themed roller coaster.
Oh,
And going through the roller coaster takes them through a dimension where they actually end up as D&D characters. And they are helped/harassed by a character who's called the Dungeon Master, who puts them into awkward situations and basically endangers their lives on a pretty regular basis as they try to find a way home.
that's
It's
wild.
it's a whole thing.
Okay, that's wild. I'll have to check it out. So, Eddy, what's popular in the 1980s?
So the big games, obviously Dungeons and Dragons, but also we're starting to see the rise of non-fantasy games. So Traveler, Champions, and Call of Cthulhu are the big sellers at this point. Uh, and it's really interesting because when we talked about the last 2 episodes, what we saw was a lot of D&D inspired, or to be less charitable, D&D knockoff games. And the big selling games are not falling that category anymore. People have kind of recognized that TSR has controlled the industry in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, so people are finding different places to look into things. And another piece is in the 81 episode, I talked about military role playing was on the rise. That's already tapering off. We're going to see some elements of that in here still, but military gaming has already tapered off pretty hard. So we're now looking at the rise of more we call classic genre tabletop games, sci-fi, superheroes, and horror. These are the ones that kind of become defining RPG genres from this point forward. So that little kind of awkward space of what's going to be coming after fantasy, what's going to step up and be the next tentpole genre, we've now moved firmly to what the answer to that question is going to be.
Awesome. Very cool. It's always cool to see, too, like, games that are popular now, essentially, like, how deep-rooted they are. Like Call of Cthulhu, for example. Like, Call of Cthulhu is huge. And it's just very cool to see that it's back there. So
Yeah,
it's really awesome.
and I mean, of all 4 of those games, some version of them is still around today. There's still versions of Traveler floating around today.
Yep.
Champions, I think, around 6th edition now. And Call of Cthulhu is 7th edition. So I mean, those games all have long staying power. Unlike Timemaster, Timemaster did not sadly stick around very long.
Okay, well, let's get into Timemaster. What is Pacesetter?
So Pacesetter was, like I mentioned, kind of the first wave of post TSR companies. Mark Akers, Troy Denning, and Stephen Sullivan, along with a whole bunch of other designers, editors, and artists, formed this company after either they laid off or left TSR in the wake of the layoffs. And it shows to me the fact these are professionals, how quickly things move around, because they got laid off or let go or left in 83. Now we're in 84, and they've already made, by this time, 3 tabletop role-playing games. They've made Chill, they've made Star Ace. Chill's horror, Star Ace is sci-fi, and then Timemaster is time travel. And they're all based around one common, what we now call house system. So they use the same game mechanics for all 3 games. And Chill, again, there's a 3rd edition of that now. Star Ace is kind of a Star Trek knockoff, so that's why I kind of picked Timemaster, because it's the one that doesn't get quite as much attention as the other 2 for various reasons. And sadly, they had a really good plan. They spent a lot of money to make sure that the printing quality was good, and the layout quality was good. They wanted to make sure that the quality of the products being put out were slightly increased as a result of this, and they did that fantastically. But between the expenses of printing and what turned out to be an accountant who had been stealing money from the company, they only lasted till 1986. So they were only around for about 3 to 4 years before they had to close up shop. But they still put out 3 games and some adventures, whatnot, and some good support for all 3 of those systems, which is really impressive for what amounts to a 3-year run.
Very cool. Okay. Well, what is Timemaster Adventures in the 4th Dimension, and what makes it special?
Yeah, okay. Combining 2 questions.
Combining 2 questions so we don't have that pause. We're on timer. Eddy, go.
Sure. If only we had time travel capacity to go back and make.
If only, yeah.
So Time Master is a time travel game, as I mentioned. You are playing a member of the Time Corps. You're an agent that's actually been plucked from history and dragged into the year 7192. And from there, you travel around through history to protect time against a group known as the Demorians, which are time traveling aliens, and also time renegades, people who have just found time machines prior to 192 or 7192 and are just screwing around in time and making mistakes. As a note, this isn't the first time travel game that actually was a company called Yaquinto Publications that came out with Time Ship a year earlier. So it's the second time travel game, but I picked this one because it has some more interesting elements. For example, and quick disclosure, the stuff we're looking at the Goblinoid Games 2011 reprint of the game. Uh, but as far as I can tell, the only change to the game besides modernizing the layout in terms of like scanning it and then doing a digital version of the release is they also replaced the art. Originally had stock public domain art, now it has brand new art to it. But I think it's the only change. The content should be identical. But this is definitely a game that we're seeing a transition from the setting light to setting non-existent games we saw like in Bunnies and Burrows and in Mechanoid Invasion, where the setting was almost implicit. It didn't really tell you much about what the setting was. Because this is a time travel game, it has to kind of set things up a little more. And so as a result, this is the longest game we've looked at so far. It's 100 pages long, which sounds like very small game by modern standards, but it is twice the size of Bunnies and Burrows, and it is about 50% bigger than Mechagoid Invasion. So we're seeing a steady increase in page count as we go through the years. Uh, but there's a lot of things that we take for granted in tabletop RPGs that we're starting to see in Time Master. It's the first game I found that actually does not assume you understand all the terminology it's used. Uh, Although it's one that's kind of amusing from a personal standpoint because the person who runs the game is called the Continuum Master, and they give you a pronunciation key for how to pronounce continuum. Which, as someone who's worked in the Trinity Continuum for a number of years now,
That's what
it's
I
like,
thought of immediately. I was like, Trinity. Yeah.
and it's like, oh yeah, maybe do we have to explain how to pronounce that word? I guess I just assume I knew how to pronounce it because I've said it so much now. Um, but also, this is the first time you see a book that actively says, skim through the book and just just try to get the basics down and then play it and then come back and reference this book later. No other game that we've looked at so far does that. Every other game assumes much more of a war game or board game approach of you read the rules first, you understand the rules, and then you play the game. This is the first time we see a game that's like, yeah, just kind of skip around, just hit a couple things. And specifically, it has, although it's not included in the book we're looking at, it was included in the original game, and it's released as a separate free file on DriveThruRPG, the Instructor Adventure, where it specifically is don't worry about learning the rules. This adventure will teach you how to play as you play the adventure. And that is huge. That is game changing. That's something that, frankly, enough modern games don't necessarily do. Of that, learn how to play the game by actually playing the game itself. That's just really, really massive. Um, and on top of that, this is a game that's trying to simplify from the very intricate, detailed rule systems we've looked at in the previous games. Uh, just because a game is smaller doesn't mean it is less complex. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's useful to look back at these old games is because even though Time Master is the longest book we've looked at, it's also simpler than the previous two games. And so one thing it's trying to do is to bring everything down to a single chart called the action table, and that everything is rolled on this chart. Now, the chart is still clunky. Basically, it comes down to it's a percentile based game. So you roll D100 and you're trying to roll under your skill level, which is pretty straightforward for even games now use a version of that. So you have a 60% chance. You roll your dice under that. You subtract your roll from the percentage chance if you succeed. Then you compare that difference to the action table to see how well you succeeded. And then the defender rolls a die to see how well they defended, and then you cross-reference those to see get a code which is then compared to a different list depending on whether it's combat or mental games or argument or whatever. And so that's a lot. It's kind of awkward. You're kind of adding, subtracting, and cross referencing and checking things out. But the fact that every single mechanic in the game funnels into this one chart is elegant by 84 standards. And that's something to kind of keep in mind through this, is that this was a real attempt to try to take gaming forward. And even though it doesn't look like it's moved as much forward as we expect to from modern perspectives, compare this to, Mechanical Innovation from Palladium from 81. This is a radical difference. Even though they're both percentile-based games, they still have the core mechanic of roll percentile under your skill roll, how they approach skills, what the skills do, how you figure out what you can do. In Mechanical Innovation, every single exception, every single subsection was hand-coded, as it were. So, like combat works this way and interrogation works this way, and each of those was a separate little subsystem you had to know and master. This all goes through one chart. So there is an attempt to kind of simplify through this. And so they use that space for other things like setting up a chapter. And there's a settings chapter, kind of, sort of. What we actually have is a chapter talking about how time travel works in this game, which is interesting because we're still in 84. Take a step away from tabletop for a second. We're past Star Wars, so science fantasy as a genre exists. We are nearing the end of classic Doctor Who, so the idea of fantastical interpretations of time travel exists, but we're not really firmly out of hard sci-fi as a concept in tabletop gaming. Again, Traveller is one of the biggest games, and so this is a game. Traveller is a game that has things like we're going to calculate the speed of your ships and how fast they can move and how big the circumference of planets are. This kind of hard data is a part of the game and expected to be fun. So uh, the explanations of it come across as very hard sci-fi. There are laws that you have to follow. There are core timelines. Each of them has a code. But what's interesting is that if you have watched a recent show like Loki, and then you look at the rules here, there's not that much difference. So what they call T0 is the core timeline. And then there are different kinds of timelines that diverge from T0. There are twin timelines, which are parallel timelines, where they're basically identical as far as you can tell. Then there's moderately different, radically different, and totally alien, and those are kind of different qualifiers for timelines and branches. Um, Also, some of the laws are things like you can't go past a certain limit in time travel. In T0, that's 7192. So basically, from the perspective of the time core, you are only going backwards in time. You can never go forward. You can't go past your quote unquote modern day. From our player perspective, that gives us still plenty of time to explore future things from our perspective. But there's a very kind of firm, you can't go further than the time core exists. There's also the idea that timelines will tend to repair themselves if left alone. So if you remove elements that are disrupting timelines, then the timeline will eventually kind of repair itself. Which again, very kind of low-key time variance authority, get rid of these problematic elements. Then we get to some interesting things. There's the law of identity, which is that nothing can exist twice or in two places at the same time. So all the characters you're playing are taken from history to become time core agents. You can never go back to your own timeline. So you can't. So if I, Eddy Webb, were taken from 2021, I can't go to any point in time from when I was born in 19 to 2021. No, I can't go to any of that time structure because then I would exist in two places simultaneously. I can only go from before I was born or after I die, or it was taken from time or whatever. The other thing is also the law of death, which is if you die, you're dead. You can't. No time travel shenanigans can bring you back from death. And then it just kind of leaves it there. It doesn't really explain why. It just kind of that's just how it is. And so that's why I say we're almost to a setting chapter here. One of the things that's really cool about Timemaster is the first setting-ish chapter that's told in narrative voice. a character, your time travel agent contact, is telling you all of this information. And so that always gives the added advantage of the game master can say, well, maybe this character got it wrong and that information is not true, so they can quietly adjust the game on the back end to address that. But also, it does mean that this character doesn't know why that time travel thing is, so you're just dead. And then the game does not spend time to say, well, what's really happening is blah. There's not a separate game master only chapter or continuum master only chapter that actually explains that. That's just all the information you have. So we're not quite there yet. Um, but like I mentioned before, it's not when you actually get into the system itself, it's not that far from the Mechanoid invasion, which was only 3 years prior to this. It's basically you have attributes which are percentage based. Those have skills that are directly associated with them, and a fairly lengthy number of skills. Uh, some skills are a little more complicated, where you have to average three attributes together. So it's like add three together, divide by three, and get the average of those three attributes, and that's your skill rating. But you only calculate that once, and it's put on a character sheet. So it's not too far from where we were before. But what's interesting is again, kind of presaging where games are going to go. A lot of the skills have a here's what success looks like, because I mentioned before there's a chart with codes, and so each of the skills says, okay, if you get this code, here's what success looks like. If you get this code, how you get more success and more success. And so we're starting to see things that look almost like World of Darkness stuff, where if you have one dot, it's this. If it's three dots, it's this. If 5 dots, it's this. We're starting to see gradated success before, as opposed to binary success, and then telling the reader, here's what those look like. Here's some examples of what that can look like. So you see more advice on how to actually use the system. Um, and then the other thing that I want to kind of really point out in terms of it's interesting is because it's a time travel game, one thing that's very clever is they have an idea called significance. Every person or item has a significance rating, which is just a number, and you add those together, and that is the significance rating of the mission. So, if I'm going to try to stop George Washington from being assassinated before signing the you know Declaration of Independence, that might be a significant ratings of like 800, which is massive. Whereas opposed to trying to stop Joe Bob in 2017 from tripping and falling and hitting his nose on a crack, uh, maybe that's significance of like 150. So, and that's you're told in character this is significant rating the event you're going to. Every time you make a mistake, every time you screw up the mission or do something that would cause phase 3 to go off track, you start losing points off that significance, and that significance gets drops lower and lower and lower. And then once you finish the mission, you make a D1000 roll, which is three D10s. It's ludicrous. Uh, but then if you quote unquote fail the roll, if you roll higher than that, um, it repairs itself somehow. But if you roll lower than that, history's changed. So basically, the more mistakes you make, the easier it is for history to change. But also separately, um, the final significance of the mission is how many experience points you get. So the more mistakes you make, the less experience you get. So you're incentivized to go in and make as few mistakes as possible to try to get things back on track. Um, I feel like when you actually use it as a table, like it's probably a lot more finicky than I would like. But the idea of there's this not only a number that tracks both how well you did and also how much experience you get, but separately is an in character number that people can reference. It gives you some license to metagame, which for a time travel game makes sense because we know how history goes, and so we have to stop it from going a certain direction. So there's already kind of a metatextual examination of history happening there, and so adding a metagame layer on top of that is not that far off. So it's an interesting mechanic that I've not seen used again, probably because again it's a little more finicky than it lets on. But it's an interesting concept that I'm surprised more games have at least made an attempt at. But then we move into kind of the bad news. I talked a lot about how this game is very forward focused. But in the back half of the game, we start to see the remnants of the 70s era military gaming coming to fore. Um, there is a 14-step sequence of play, quote unquote, which is basically combat. There are 13 pages of combat rules, 9 more pages of heavy weapons and vehicle combat, 4 pages on full-blown military battles. That is 25% of the book. It is a lot of military roleplay. So the game is kind of assuming you could time travel everywhere in the world, but you're probably going to wars. That's what the game is kind of telling you is the gameplay it expects to be. You know, you're not going to Woodstock and trying to save Woodstock. You're going to Caesar's legions and trying to stop them from overthrowing whatever. That's what the game's assuming you're doing, which is odd. It's an odd choice. It doesn't resemble a lot of the time travel fiction we're used to now. Again, heavily inspired by Doctor Who, but also Loki, Guardians of the Galaxy, all these other shows that reference time travel. We're used to much more personal time travel stories now. But in 84, it assumed you're going to big, huge set piece historical events and making changes. But I do want to kind of look at combat because there's an interesting bit in combat that games today still use. And I want to talk about why it's kind of carried over and why I think it's dumb. Uh, there's a thing where you have to declare what you're doing before you roll initiative. And a lot of games now tend to assume you roll initiative, and then when it comes around to your turn, you declare what you're doing. So, and that feels very natural from 30-ish years of game evolution, where it's your turn, say what you're going to do. But this comes from a time period where we're still looking at that antagonistic relationship between game master and player. And everyone needs to be playing fair, quote unquote, because there was genuine concern in the culture at this time that the game master or player may change their action based on what previous people did. And so the argument was everyone declares what they're planning to do, then you roll your initiative. And then you see if you can actually take that action. There are penalties for if you want to change your action. So, like, for example, I, player A, am trying to shoot NPC B, and NPC B is trying to run away. So I declare I'm going to shoot, A is going to shoot B, and B declares they're going to run away. If B wins initiative, they're going to run away, and I have no one left to shoot. So my action is wasted. I can't. I have to. If I want to do something else, I have to make a roll to see if I can change my action. But of course, if I get initiative, then I get to shoot B, and B can't run away because B's been shot. So that was the argument was this way everyone can quote play fair because you don't get to always do what you want to in the heat of battle. Again, stems from that military wargaming element of you had to write down your order of battle and then you determine how the battle actually plays out. And it's weird that that has still stuck around in some games, even today. The idea that you have to declare action before you get to take your action. Whereas we are much more used to a narrative design of that all the initiative is doing is telling you which turn you can do your cool thing. And it assumes that you're naturally aware of ebb and flow in battle, and you're going to take the optimal action each stage because we've moved from is this fair to the group as a whole with this antagonist relationship with the GM to it's now time for me to do my cool moment. Of course, everyone should be able to do a cool moment at their time because otherwise it's no fun to roll, get to your turn, and not be able to do anything. So that's a game culture shift that's happened, and we're seeing kind of that liminal state between full narrativism and the kind of military mindset of tabletop design. So that's why this kind of weird thing is kind of stuck in amber, as it were. Um, NPCs, when we get into NPC session, that's kind of interesting. Um, it covers some unusual things. It covers morale, for example, which is actually a concept that's been around since D&D. I believe is actually in first edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It has morale of people just fleeing if they're taking too much damage or other factors occur. Again, that's actually one thing that I'm surprised more modern games don't use advantage of. Because now the modern design is you run out of your wounds or hit points or whatever, and then that character goes down. The idea of people fleeing a fight just isn't a thing anymore, and I feel like video games probably shaped that direction. But again, that's a very much a wargaming thing because military units would break. And so morale comes from that wargaming style. So that's something that has aged well, but weirdly we don't design very much anymore. But so in other games we've seen stuff like that morale, but this takes that and expands it out to how people react to you. So you have a chart that you, or sorry, a set of results that you can proffer from the action chart that determine, okay, does this person like me or hate me on first glance? That's something that's relatively new conceptually. And also things like legal problems. What happens if you get arrested in 1940? What happens if you need to hide out in 2017? So it gets into elements that are not militaristic, but it's such a weirdly short section compared to the 20 plus pages of militaristic stuff moving forward. But you start to see that people are thinking, well, there's more than just fighting that we can do in these games. So it will grow and it can grow, but you're starting to see the genesis of that right in that moment. Um, but again, I even put my notes like I want way more of this than military nonsense, but we're just coming off that military glut. So it still feels like this is what players want, but we'll see pretty soon that turns out players don't want this anymore. And then we go into kind of the second book, quote unquote, of Timemasters, which is all more information about timelines, really. It's adventure hooks, it's timelines. And again, it's interesting because it's the first thing we see of like, here's just a bunch of adventure ideas, frankly. And it's presented through, it's the War of Independence, it's the Roman legions, it's that kind of stuff. But it's still also here's cool things you can do, here's cool characters you can meet, and what they could do, and what they might want to, how you can twist history. So it becomes a whole bunch of setting hooks, which is something we hadn't quite seen in any game we've examined so far. So we're starting to see that, but then also it has 2 pages of military formations. So it's like, "Hey, here's how your troops line up," and it's just like, ah. But so I mean, again, we're not quite there yet, and also it's very Europe centric. Again, not surprising for '84, perhaps, but it's also another place that's in voice. So this is a character telling you here are some historical hotspots and what they may or may not do as your career as a time agent. So it gives you a lot of flexibility and fluidity in that front. But then it also has things like how you can use Time Master as a gateway to other tabletop games. So you can time travel into a D&D like setting, or you can travel into the future and use Star Ace, or you can travel to the modern day and use Chill. So I mean, hey, good thing we have this common system for everything. But it's the first time we've seen a game that's like, here's how to use our game to play different games, or how to take our game and change it. And that's very quietly revolutionary. It's game is please telling you, here's some information. It might be wrong. Change it. It's the previous games have done that with rules. Previous games have said if the rule doesn't work, adapt it and change it. And we saw it way back in Bunnies and Burrows, even where that was pretty radical for '76. But it's still assumed that what little setting you got, those pieces they need to determine were pretty much law, and then you built off of that. This one's saying we're gonna give you a lot more, but adapt it and change it to your needs. So it's still keeping that flow of we assume you're gonna be making your own game, but we're giving you a starting point. And by giving explicit permission to change that is a sea change. It's a small sea change. It's quietly revolutionary, but we're moving to this isn't written in stone. So that's really interesting. Um, we also have an explicit metagame narrative currency called luck. You have a mechanic called luck, and you spend a point to dodge out of the way of something, to not get killed, to have something kind of appear in the world if you need be. And it's very much, I'm spending a point to change the game. The reason why a mechanic exists is because this game is super, super deadly. It will kill you. Protagonists do not have plot armor. So if you pop up in the middle of a war and just go, "Hey, cool, I'm a time agent. Start doing stuff with me." You're going to get steamrolled and probably murdered. So you need something like luck to keep you alive because the game is very aggressive in how it kills you. So it's those interesting balance. Again, we're not quite to the protagonists of the tabletop games are the center of the universe yet. You're assuming you're kind of just slubs that also happen to have a chrono scooter for reasons. But it starts to say, well, that's not quite fun. So let's give them mechanics that can change and adjust that. So it's again one of those. I keep saying this, but it's Time Master is so interesting because it's so clearly stuck between the 70s and the 90s mode because 90s is when narrativism really takes off. So and it's so perfectly preserved. In fact, it wraps up with the most important rules, and the most important rules literally are have fun and control your game so players don't get out of control, which is so explicitly a mission statement of mid-80s game design. It's like we're moving out of the control the game stage. We're moving into the just have fun stage, but we're not quite there. So we have to put them at equal weight in front of players to recognize these are both things that should be happening simultaneously in your game and gives you no real advice on what to do if those are in conflict with each other. It's just like, eh. So it's I could go on, but like Mara said, we have to keep rolling on this. But it is Time Master is definitely a game where if you are really interested in design and wanting to see how design evolves, it's so perfectly balanced between what will come and what has come that it's really worth digging into. And I'm genuinely surprised more people aren't talking about this as from a design perspective. So that's what's cool about Time Master.
That's a lot of cool things. Um, for the record. Um, it's a lot too. Time travel's tough. Like even games now, like it's tough to to do it because there's so many rules and regulations, and like I think that this is an interesting take on how that happens.
Mhm.
So I'm really into that a lot for that purpose. Like,
Yeah, it's a very different take on time because to be honest, a lot of time travel games really use time travel as a way to just shift around the setting, right? It's like you get dumped into historical setting of the week, you screw around that space for a while, and then you leave. That's pretty much what time travel does in most time travel games. This is one that's specifically about preserving and altering time and giving you mechanics to do that in a way that is interesting in a way that I've not seen a lot of time travel games do. Um, it's just kind of a shame that it's so wedded to this militaristic approach to history.
sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. So yeah, yes. I like the you can't exist you can't exist in the same timeline
Yeah.
of your life. I think that's so overlooked as a
Mhm.
mechanic, and so I think that's very interesting that they did that, which I love.
Yeah, because I mean, it's reverse quantum leap, right?
Mhm.
It's like, quantum leap is you can, Beckett can only go through his timeline. This is just the only place you can't go is your timeline. And so it's the one place that you would feel comfortable and your knowledge would be useful is the one place you can't go adventure to. And
Yeah.
because you're a group, the players kind of opting into, okay, here are the time places that we just can't go as a group.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I don't know if it's good, but
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yes. Uh, from where we're standing. Yeah.
Right,
So,
right.
okay. So where does that leave us in terms of where we are now? Um, how is it? How is it changed and influenced? And I'm looking at the link on our site from what that is. So that's what we're leading into. And then I got to talk about design stuff, and I'm very excited.
It's
Go
true. It's true.
ahead.
So it has. I touched on some of this, but it has influenced the industry in some pretty key ways. First, it is one of the first universal chart designs. Specifically, this is just a year or two before TSR's Marvel Superheroes, which is kind of seen by a lot of people as the apex of 80s universal chart design. Um, and it's pretty similar. It's you roll percentiles against a certain number and you find a result and then apply that result. So the idea of standardizing and consolidating all of your dice manipulations into one core mechanic is a big thing that this helps influence the industry. You start to see glimmers of narrative design. You actually have a low barrier on character concepts. If you recall from Mechanoid Invasion, there was like 17 different character classes. So you have all these options, but they're all very specifically delineated. So it's like you have a wide variety of choices, but that's because we've given you very explicit choices. This is the play whoever you want from history, basically. It's the as long as you're from 7192 or previously, play whoever you want to. And that's again a pretty huge shift from D&D style class design. And also, there is a currency for metagame manipulation and explicit directions on telling people how to make the game for fun. So it's a game that's giving you customizable options both in the reading of the book and also on the fly at the table. So those are codifying a direction that was steadily happening since '76. And then finally, you have an Instructor Adventure that introduces people to how to play the game. That's a huge, and it was specifically a thing that Pacesetter explicitly innovated. That was something that they as designers set out to do and create. They did a fantastic job of it. In fact, they even introduced, they had a game called Sandman, which is unrelated to the Vertigo comic, but it was just an adventure. It had no core rulebook to go with it. And so it taught you the game through the adventure, but that was the only way you could not play the game was playing the adventure. So Instructor Adventures was they specifically set out to try to design, innovate, and put out into the market. So a lot of my influence the industry stuff is stuff that I feel like how it influenced the industry, but that is one area I can point to and say, no, Timemaster, Chill, and Star Ace specifically introduced Instructor Adventures to the tabletop industry, full stop. As far as we could tell, that is where it started. So that's one area I specifically want to make sure they get full credit for.
That's awesome and approachable.
Yes.
Very much so. I think that a lot of times, even now, I think that a lot of times, sometimes, systems can be daunting in that regard because it's like so much, but having a nice introductory is great. I think everyone should do it.
Right. And something I kind of glossed over before, but it's worth kind of reiterating is that this is when D&D has hit the cultural populace. And so prior to '83, it was assumed your average tabletop gamer is someone who's familiar with wargaming and therefore is used to reading a whole bunch of rules and parsing 50, 60 pages of rules before they start playing. And now we're moving to people who pick this up at Walden Books and don't know what the heck this weird thing is that has no board in it. And so this is the first company to think about how do we actually do that. D&D will come along later and do more along that line. Because Redbox Design's coming, the D&D instructory set is coming out right about the same time. They have a different take on that same thing, and they also have their own instructory adventure. But Pacesetter was specifically thinking about all of their games. They all need to be approachable and very easy for people to jump on board as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Oh, this is so cool. Go on.
So, from an aesthetic perspective, what do you think?
From an aesthetic perspective, I got it pulled up right here. So in the past, we've talked about how every game that we've picked up has evolved. It started with black and white, one single color, a cover, very, very much like sketches in Bunnies and Burrows. And then it kind of evolved to like more, I don't want to say professional sketches because art is amazing, but more refined, with Palladium. The time is so 80s. It's so 80s. The cover is hella 80s.
Oh my God.
It's red border with bright yellow. And it's in kind of that, it's in that lean where it looks like it's scrolling up, which I think is very interesting that they did that specifically. And you got a raptor on there, a plane, a boat. It's very cool. It's very Tron too. Like it's so cool in that regard, because it has this person just riding the ship, and there's just everything you can think of in history just basically showing up and popping up behind them, which is very, very cool. And it's got those sweet red flames in the back, which I love. It
Which needs to be
gives
airbrushed
me,
the side of a van, honestly.
yeah, honestly, like this is the stuff that's which I learned last year or 2 years ago. I didn't know that was a thing.
Oh, really?
No, I didn't. But this is perfect to be airbrush on a van. It's very, very cool in that regard. But it's such a step up from different. I should say different because it's so much more involved, right? You have a lot of color usage. You're taking that refined artwork and really, really spending a lot of time on coloring it. I mean, like it has so much to it.
This could have been
really
a comic
cool.
book cover in the 80s, honestly.
Yeah. It is hella 80s though. It's like so 80s is painful. And something we start to see is the second page is also red. So like we're moving away from that, like only the cover has color, right? With the yellow and the white on there, which yellow on red, fun fact, is not great for visual purposes for a lot of our friends. So it's interesting that was the route that they went with. But you see a lot of things in the 80s with that yellow text on red. That was a big thing to do back then. So that was really cool. And then you have these scenes. That's another thing too. Scenes are a big thing that they're incorporating. I mean, it's on page 3, and because in Palladium's books they sort of had scenes. This is like a fully done scene where you have somebody holding a phaser gun, and and a lot's happening in the background, and there's just a lot of detail to it. So that's very cool to me. It's weird when you said it was like 100 pages, because for Meredith currently, I'm like, oh, that's nothing, Right. But back then, like you said, like that's a lot. And the other thing too is it's in 3 columns, which means that they got a lot of information in there. It's not just that it's 100 pages because they have a lot of content. They really, really have 3 columns worth of stuff, and they break it up. This is very cool. Usually when you have like sidebars and things like that, they are literally to the side. But they just, on the first couple pages, they just have this big break of dice. And it's big and it's large. And I have not seen that in a while. How dices essentially look like, oh, this is 1d10, this is 2d10. Okay, this is what the percent dice is. And actually doing the math, usually you see that in text, where it's like, this is how you do it. This is the math problem. Whereas this is like, for me, I appreciate as a visual learner, like, because I'm like, oh, I can see this instead of reading it. So that's helpful and very cool. We keep going through it, and like I said, they're doing a lot of scenes. Like it's a lot of very interesting that they went into such detail, which I really like. And it reminds me of a newspaper as well, because you got the top, with the like chapter 2, welcome to the corpse. And I like that as well because there's such a separation to break it, which is really, really good. And they have a little hourglass, which is nice. And then they have like the continuum. Seeing that is very cool. It's a very good book for visual learners. Is what I'm feeling when I look through this, because again, I can read something 100 times, but if I see it, I'm like, oh, that's how that works. That's cool. So that's very helpful in that regard.
Which, especially for a game like this, which has a lot of abstract concepts like time travel, so being able to visually represent those is really, really helpful. I completely agree.
Absolutely. And so I think that having that is really, really great. Once they get into the math portion, that kind of drops a little bit, and they spend more time on tables, which is what we see currently. Tables is also really, really good too. But they bring it back in chapter 4, and they experiment too with I'm consistently thinking about Onyx Path when I look at this sometimes, because it has the has the artwork like, either a half a page or a quarter page, and they're playing around with that too. I think that with this, they're experimenting more with different types of artwork, which is very awesome to me.
Because in the last two books, the picture more or less basically was either in the column or a whole page. This is the first book, at least if I'm remembering correctly, where the art breaks across a couple of columns or all three columns, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's cool about it, right? Is just it's that nice break. And like we even see it, like I said, I'm mentioning Onyx Path because that's what happens sometimes. They have that nice, it's a nice like cool break. And the other thing that's cool too is, you read the section and then it's a relevant art piece. So you can even get the like essentially the atmosphere of it, which I think is really, really rad. I like that for their weapons, essentially, they have little icons. Very cool too. Which is really, really rad. And they're super simple. They're super, super simple. Super like just black and white, but it looks good, which I appreciate very much so. And then the more you get into it, the more they're putting in visuals, the more art they're putting in towards the middle, which is cool because it's like they started it, like they were like cautious about it in the beginning, and then they start to pick it up a little bit, which is also interesting. And as you go through, there's more of these art pieces, which is rad. The 3-column, like I said, is the biggest shift. That's a big one, I think. Yeah, because everyone's doing 2 columns. Everyone was doing 2 columns. Everyone was doing 2 columns.
Everyone's doing 2 columns.
Everyone was doing 2 columns. So like the TLDR of this is that it's very. Oh, and they have little chits in the back too, little standees, which counters. Chits or counters. They have those, which is very, very cool. I like that a lot. And I mean, even the character sheet is a little more detailed too. There's a lot to put down, and I think that's also different. But you're seeing that, that's a whole character sheet. A lot of date of birth, age of recruitment, original profession, education, height, weight, current age, eye color, hair color. Like it's a lot. It's a lot. So,
but I mean that gets information that wasn't even shown on other character sheets because like here's stats and stats. But this is like going, what's your nationality?
So that's really, really cool. So I think that the short version of this is that we're starting to get into more detailed stuff. We're starting to see a lot more experimentation. We're starting to see them start essentially, and I'm sure other publishers have done this, but step away from the 2-column, very simple black and white art, a handful of visual aids. We're stepping away and a more detailed character sheet, and I think that's super cool to me, Meredith. So cool. I'm into that. So I'm very excited to see. It's cool for me because you can see it. I mean, you literally see it evolve, and it is something so simple. And then, like I said, people start experimenting, and it's interesting to see what has changed and what stayed, like even in the modern times too.
Absolutely.
So,
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Closing remarks. Eddy, do you have any closing remarks?
I think we pretty much covered it. Next time, we're going to move into the 90s. I'm going to pick the seminal game of 1991. No, not Vampire the Masquerade. Tales of the Floating Vagabonds. It's an early example of explicitly humorous tabletop games.
Yeah.
But also, it's not the kind of humorous tabletop game you expect. We have a very specific idea of how humorous tabletop games work, and Tales of the Floating Vagabond does not do that.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to talk about that next time.
Yeah, I'm hype. Hype. Yeah, hype. Yeah, so next month, Tales of the Floating Vagabond, 1991.
91, yep.
It's very important. We are moving away from the 80s.
It's also one of the first Avalon Hill RPGs. So
interesting.
So watching a company known so heavily for war games moving into RPGs and a humor RPG on top of it, there's some interesting stuff to dig into there.
Yeah, that's super cool, and we've had some time pass, right? Like, so we're gonna see the 90s evolve. You know, like, are they gonna leave the hella 80s cover? What are they gonna do? So
Spoiler, it will not.
Yeah. But what
not
if
91.
Not 91? No. Yeah, so we'll see how that goes. So, all right. Well, Eddy, thank you so much for joining us and being my co-host. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you?
They can find me at Pugsteady.com, which is my company website. They can also find me as Pugsteady on Twitter. It's Pugsteady. You can also find me hanging out at theonyxpath.com or on the Onyx Path Discord.
Awesome. As I said, my name is Meredith Gerber. You can find me at Meredith Gerber pretty much anywhere. Twitter, the Instas, everywhere. The Instas. It's technically Meredith A. Gerber, but people will find me. It's fine. Look for Birds with a Head Shave. You'll find one. And so also a special thanks to Lysa for being our tech wizard. Thank you, Lysa. And yeah, we'll see y'all next time. Oh, Lisa's sending me private messages. But we will see you all next time. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we hope everyone has a good day.
Bye.
All right. Bye.